Hello, everyone. I'm Ed Densel, and I host Unfound, and I run this YouTube channel. I realize you don't want to give a thumbs up to the following video until you watch it. You know what? That's totally understandable. I can appreciate that. But what you can do right now is subscribe to this channel. The button is right there. Thanks.
Harry Dennis Milligan was a 21-year-old from Avery, Iowa. He was going to college and was a Marine reservist. In the early morning hours of July 1st, 1984, in Albia, Iowa, friends watched as Harry got into his car to drive home. Harry never made it there. He and his car were never seen again. I'm Ed Densel, and this is Unfound. We all have friends. We all want friends. In fact, the truth is, we need friends. Even if we're in intimate relationships, even if we consider ourselves to be hermits, even if we like to think of ourselves as self-sufficient islands. People who have friends are healthier, live longer lives, and just are more pleasant people in general. However, one thing I could have never predicted before starting Unfound is how unhelpful friends can be concerning disappearances. Even if these men and women were there when their confidants went missing. Some examples: James Walker, Joshua Guimond, J.L. Hamblin, Jesse Ross, and there are many more. Granted, in some of these cases, those friends make very good suspects. Yet that then takes us to why would friends cause a friend to go missing? It's hard to understand. Well, with the disappearance of Harry Milligan, we all are once again confronted with friends who were there when someone went missing. And their stories don't exactly sound solid. Should we suspect these bosom buddies? And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Linez's website, charleyproject.org. Harry Milligan was the kind of guy the rest of us would have loved to hate. He was Mr. Personality. He did well in high school. Harry was even great at sports. On top of all of that, following a family tradition, Harry joined the Marine Reserves. Really, the only part of his life that seemed to be unfulfilled was dating a nice young lady. However, some of this came to an end in college. Harry did a little too much partying. In addition, he found out he had to actually study to get A's, and this was a problem. And in the weeks before his disappearance, Harry was probably at the lowest point in his life. Although I'm not sure we could call it low. So on June 30th, 1984, a Saturday evening, Harry went out. Living in the tiny town of Avery, he drove to Albia, about 6 miles away. According to the best information now known almost 40 years later, Harry went to a bar where he took part in a poker game. He did well and walked away with some cash. Harry was seen by a variety of people who knew him, and he ended up riding around with some guys he had known since childhood. Eventually, at about 4:30 a.m., Harry got dropped off at his car and the friends watched him drive away, headed toward Avery. He and his car were never seen again. There was only one lake on Harry's route home. Police searched it, and they found nothing. Since then, rumors have run the gamut about what happened to Harry. Like those disappearances where people have called for rides, then not been there when their rides showed up, the idea that friends could be such horrible witnesses, even to the point of them being suspects, is something I could have never anticipated when I started Unfound. But it is certainly a thing. Yet, please don't jump to any conclusions. Try to answer these 3 questions as you listen to the rest of this episode. Number 1. Is not knowing the exact details of Harry's movements that night suspicious, or is it just a factor of a case being this old? Number 2. Would the downturn in Harry's life really have been enough for him to consider leaving it? And number 3. Are Harry's friends really being less than truthful, or is this just a factor of the public not having anyone else to blame? Harry's family can't help but think that something of a foul play nature happened that early morning. The guest for this episode is Harry's younger brother, Mark Milligan. Unfound News. Did you catch yesterday's YouTube show with Dr. Telesco? I hope you did. We discussed the disappearance of Jesse Ross, a case that has a lot of different theories. If you missed it, you can go to the Unfound website, theunfoundpodcast.com, to watch the entire show. Next, it's the end of the month. You know what that means. Newsletter. If you're on the list, you should be getting it before the end of today, April 1st. If you're not on the mailing list, please contact me at unfoundpodcast@gmail.com, and I can make it happen. Finally, the new format on YouTube continues. You can watch me interview this week's guest on Zoom, and you get to watch me record the entire episode. Please go to the Unfound YouTube channel to see me in action.
Where you can find Unfound: Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Stitcher, Podbean, and many other platforms, especially outside the United States. Unfound has social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Speaking of YouTube, join me on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern on the Unfound Podcast Channel for the live show, the only one of its kind in true crime. Ask questions, chat with other viewers, and give the show a thumbs up. You can contribute to Unfound in the following ways: patreon.com/Unfound Podcast, paypal.me/Unfound Podcast. Contribute during the live show with Super Chat, and join the YouTube membership program for the low price of $2.99 per month. I need to thank the following people for contributions to Unfound this week: Linda, AZ Love Rider, and Deborah. The website, theunfoundpodcast.com, the email address, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com, and please mention Unfound at all true crime websites and forums. Thank you. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the brother of Harry Milligan, Mark Milligan. Mark, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Let's start here. Let's talk about the Milligan family. The listeners and viewers know that we usually start in this area when we have a family member on the program. Let's just talk about the Milligan family. How many kids were there. My understanding is you are Harry's older brother. How many kids were there? Let's just talk about the Milligan family, like in the 70s into the 80s. What was it like living in Iowa, all of you together?
Okay, so actually, I'm the youngest one. I'm the younger
Oh,
brother. Okay,
oh, okay.
Harry was born in '62. I was born in '65.
Wow.
It's
Okay.
a very weird makeup of a family. When I say, and the reason I say that is because um, I was raised by my grandparents, and adopted by my grandparents. So that's what made me and Harry brothers. Biologically, we're not truly
Oh.
brothers. We're brothers through the fact that in my dad's first marriage, he adopted Harry
Huh.
right out of the hospital. A short time after that, he split up with um, his first wife. Then he met my what would be my grandma, or what I call my mom.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was raised by him, adopted by him. She had four older kids that were pretty well grown. I mean, they were all getting married, and they were 19, 20 years old when me and Harry. Harry was probably I'm gonna say probably two or three. Or I was two or three when I came into the picture. My mom and dad had problems. My grandparents took me. They started raising me and Harry together, and like I say, eventually I was adopted by him by choice. That was my choice that I made later on in life. So when I say brother, it's not necessarily my biological brother,
Huh.
but he's my brother. And then there's four older siblings that the only one it's like I say, what makes it weird is when you're adopted by your grandparents legally. You know, if you look at it on paper, it makes my mom my sister. In a way. I mean, it's very strange, but just because of being adopted by your grandparents. So there was four older kids. They were all married. Or older, got married, and then Harry came along with my grandfather, and then me from one of my grandparents' older kids. So it's a very
That's
strange,
complicated.
yeah, very strange deal. But I came into the picture I was probably two or three. So I mean, that's all I ever knew. I mean, I was raised by my grandparents. Me and Harry were raised in the same house. He was, 2 years older than I was, and that's all we knew. We grew up being brothers, and nobody, most people, for the most part, didn't know any different. I mean, they didn't. There was a select few that did that knew the whole family makeup and things, but um, that's kind of how it came about. And I mean,
Wow.
um, so it was an interesting, I mean, it was an interesting childhood, I guess, or an interesting uh,
Mm-hmm.
life. I mean, because like I say, um, as far as I'm concerned, we might as well have been biological brothers. I mean,
Right.
because we didn't know any different. I mean, we shared a bedroom when we were kids. What he got for Christmas, I got for Christmas. I mean, we got all the same. You got the same things. I mean, the typical family, setting. I mean, everything was the same. I mean, we just never knew any different. I mean, we
Okay.
both knew it. He knew he was adopted. I mean, and I knew that. I knew that I wasn't. I guess my grandparents' kid. But later on, like I say, I chose to take their name and be adopted and everything else. So
Okay.
it's kind of a strange deal, but
All right. So, would you say that being that you were not biologically related, but you were brothers anyway, would you say that you were similar, or did you? How would you compare maybe his personality to your personality, your interests, your hobbies? Going back and
uh,
forth between the both of you.
as as far as personalities, I think we were complete. We were night and day in a way. Um, when it came to interests and things, we had the same interests. I mean, night and day. Harry was one of those kids that he used to make me so mad because he if he picked up a book in school and had to take a test on it, he could look at it for an hour and take a test and get an A plus. And I could study the same book for a week, and be lucky if I got a C. I mean, and be stressed out over that. I mean, so he was very smart. He was very funny. He was um, but along with that funny, smart side was the kind of stubborn side too. I mean, he was smart. One of the people that was so smart that if he thought he was right, you better have your A game to prove him wrong, because he just wasn't going to prove. I mean, he wasn't going to just accept anything. It was he thought he was right, and that's the way it was. Where me, I was kind of the kid that just went along with the program and tried to get good grades and do what I was supposed to. But we had the same interests. We competed in everything. I mean, we played football in the backyard, basketball in the backyard, baseball. You name it, we played it. We were into sports, and it was always nothing but who's going to be better than the other one. And of course, him being the bigger brother, he always thought he had to be all the time. So and that, I mean, we had a good relationship at that point, and we were similar in a lot of ways with our interests, but just completely two different people as far as the I guess the physical makeup of things, when it comes to intelligence and all that good stuff.
What kind of older brother was he? Did he look out for you and do those things? What would you say?
I think he did. I mean, him and his older friends. I mean, they, I guess I go back to the school days, like the high school days. When I'm a freshman and he's a junior, and and I'm a sophomore, he's a senior. Yeah, he looked out for me to some extent, but he also had a good time with his buddies picking on me too. I mean, so, but if it come down to push, come to shove, I knew that he always had my back, and it was that way when we were younger too. That if you messed with one of us, the other one was going to stick up for him. I mean,
Right.
So he was always good in that way, I think.
Mm-hmm. You brought up sports before, maybe you guys playing basketball in the backyard, etc. Did he play any organized sports in high school, or what did he do in high school? What kind of was he in any clubs or anything? Going back to '83, when he, near graduation.
Yeah, yeah. When he was in high school, I mean, he competed in everything. I mean, he played basketball, he played football, he played golf.
Huh.
You name it. I mean, if it was a sport, Harry, Harry pretty much played it. We played, through even before that, we were big into playing in Little League, competed in, what they had around here back in those days was the old punt, pass, and kick competitions and stuff like that. And, I think I probably still got some news articles somewhere that, we both always finished first in that. He was a very good athlete. He was, I think he was all state in football as a wide receiver, and, played basketball, and, which was, I guess, one thing I did kind of skip over earlier, I mean, which was really kind of shocking, because when he was born club footed. Both feet were turned completely in, and they had to they literally broke both of his legs and set him back straight, and he was in a cast for a long time, from the waist down to keep his legs straight and everything else, and then to later on go on and be as athletic as he was. Even my dad used to say that, he couldn't believe that, how far he actually came after being born the way that he was.
Wow, that is a story.
Yeah.
Could you even tell? I mean, when he became a teenager, could you even tell that he had been born that way? I guess
Nope.
not.
I mean, really, you couldn't. I mean, most people had no idea. I mean, yeah. Looking at him, you'd have never known.
Okay. All right. So I guess he graduated high school.
Yep, graduated high school, and like I said, he done really well in high school. Was into everything, and
Mm-hmm.
one thing that most people will tell you about Harry that he went to high school with, he was everybody's friend. I mean, he was just one of them guys that liked to laugh and joke and have a good time, and he got good grades and just enjoyed his friends, and graduated high school, and then he kind of worked around, around the area for a while doing some stuff. I think he worked at Kness Manufacturing for a little bit, which is a mousetrap building factory that we had here in town, and done some things like that. And then he ended up at one point. I joined the Marine. It's kind of weird. I joined the Marine Corps first, just out of a kind of a whim, I guess. once, and our dad
Sometimes
was
that happens.
yeah, I was looking at colleges and a lot of different things going on, and ran into a Marine recruiter and thought, you know what, I don't want to go to school anymore. I'm gonna do something different. So, my dad was a Marine. I joined the Marines, and not too long after that, Harry got the idea to join the Marines. But he, like I said, he was the smart one. He was using it. He enrolled and was going to college at Northeast Missouri State, which is now, I think, Truman State down in Kirkville, Missouri. But he joined the Marines and went into the reserve so that he could use the reserve program, the Marine, college program, to help pay for his college and stuff. So, and he really kind of had it. I guess the way I look at it, he had everything you could want, because Truman State College in Kirkville's maybe 40 minutes from home, 45 minutes from home, maybe at the most. So you go to college, you stay down there during the week. If you feel like it, you come home on the weekend, you crash at mom and dad's house, and you go party and do everything with your friends that are still around that you went to high school with. So, I guess looking back now, I'm like, well, he really did that smart. I took off and, I ended up out in California in the Marines and didn't know anybody. And it's like, holy, that was scary, So
you end up at Paris Island, and he ends up at school and coming back every weekend or whatever, or wherever.
Right? Exactly. So I mean, And so it's I think he was pretty smart on that point. I know once he got to college, then I think things just kind of got a little out of control for him. It sounds like. I mean, I was gone during a lot of that time because I'd already went in the Marine Corps. But he was having problems with his grades and doing a lot of
let's talk about that. Let's talk about that specifically, because you said that he did well in high school, but then he goes to college and had some struggles. I can relate to that. Why do you think that was? What do you think brought that on?
Like I said before, Harry was a people person. He loved his friends and being with people and hanging out. And I just think he hadn't grown up enough or learned how to manage that, to where he got to partying and drinking and running with the friends, and the grades started slipping. And, it just wasn't typically his normal, I guess, for what he had done in high school. To him, school was always easy, so.
What was his major? Do you even remember? When he went missing, what year of school was he in? Do you remember?
I think he was just in his first year, actually, when he because he graduated in '81, worked around here for a while, went to the Marine Corps, come back, and that's when he went to school. So I think he was his first year of school. His first time really being in that environment. Staying down there, living down at the dorms. Might have been his second year. I don't remember.
Okay. All right, and you've already stated that even though you were younger, and I think that's probably why I thought you were older, because in a previous conversation you said you were in the Marines when he went missing. So I'm thinking, well, you must be the older brother, but it's weird how he was the older one, but you were the one who went into the Marines first, and then he became a Marine reservist. Yeah. That's very unusual. That's very unusual.
And he actually went to boot camp before I did, because I joined the Marine Corps. I had to wait to finish. I joined in high school, in my last part of high school, so I had to wait till I was out of high school. Well, after I had actually joined, then he joined, so he went to boot camp before I went to boot camp. So it's kind of it just flipped back and forth there for a bit of as far as who was doing what. But
So how much, being that you were in the Marines, maybe this would have made it a little difficult, but for that year of 1984, of course, we know that he disappeared in July. But for those, 6-7 months before he went missing in 1984, how often would you say you talked to him?
See, very little. I went in the Marine Corps September of '83. Went to boot camp, came home in December of '83, and then I was home for a couple of weeks. Went back to California, and really, that's what people sometimes don't understand nowadays. These younger people don't understand is, it wasn't cell phones and all that stuff. If you wanted to talk to somebody, you had to catch them at home, on a home phone line or write a letter. and at that time, I think, I had started really doing my own thing. He was doing his own thing. So there just wasn't, it's tough now for me to try to look back and put pieces of this puzzle together because, there's a pretty good gap of about 6-7 months in there where I just don't know what was going on in his life. We didn't have a chance to talk.
Let me ask you this then, being that, some of these things regarding like him not doing well in school, are these things you didn't find out until after he disappeared? Or was that something that maybe your parents passed along to you? How did you find all that out?
Most of that was all after he had disappeared. Once I got that phone call, he come up missing, June 30th, the night of June 30th into July 1st of 84. Mm-hmm. My mom called me the morning, I'm going to say, or probably later in the afternoon on July 1st, and asked me if I'd heard anything from him, or if he'd said something about coming out to California where I was at. And I'm like, no, I haven't heard nothing out of him. I'm, 18 years old. And my response was, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. He went out last night partying, just ain't made it home, Right. Well, come Friday of that week,
we'll get into that. I want to cover a few things first. We'll surely get into that. Let's talk a little bit because I think we need to set some of this up because of course we're going to eventually talk about the night that he disappeared and who he was with and all of this. So you mentioned how he was very good, very personable, outgoing, maybe an extroverted type of person. He had a lot of friends. Let's talk about some of these friends just in general, because I know that you know some of these guys who were around him that night. Let's, just talk a little bit about Jeff and Doug and Steve. How would you explain them? What did you know about them? How did you know them at the time? Of course, maybe your opinion on them has changed over the last 38 years. But at the time, you're in the Marines or before you went to the Marines. Some of these guys that we're going to eventually talk about in more detail, what did you think about them? How did you know them? Did you think that they were good friends of Harry's?
All of them were good friends of Harry's. Steve Rockwell was probably more the outsider of that group. He wasn't necessarily, I never knew Harry to really run around with him that much, but I knew, they'd associate, they would talk, or whatever. To kind of explain, like say, all three of those guys were the grade in between me and Harry. So they were younger than him and older than me. I knew them all. Jeff Adler for one, great guy. In high school, great kid, kind of shy maybe, but great guy. And he lived right next to one of my best friends that I hung out with all the time. And one of our big things is all summer long, we hung out over at his house outside playing basketball, and Jeff was always over there hanging out, playing basketball,
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say it, but it's your, great Iowa neighborhood, I hate to say it. It's, a little small town, 3,000 people, everybody knows everybody and everybody knows everybody's business, so, they were good guys. Doug Matty, the same. He was always kind of the laughter, jokester guy. Always, kind of just, cutting up and having fun.
Mm-hmm. Just so everybody understands, would this have been in Avery, Iowa? Avery?
Well, most of that was in Albia. I always came to town because I lived in a little town of Avery, which was maybe 300 people. So, during the summer, a lot of times hanging out with the friends or whatever, I'd come into town in Albia. And a lot of times I'd spend the night or a couple nights at one of my buddies' place and we'd hang out and, do what, 16, 17, 18-year-old kids do, hang out, run the streets, go to the game rooms and play basketball, baseball, or whatever we could find to do, So,
all right.
It was just typical. They were typically great guys.
All right. So your opinion of them up until Harry disappeared was pretty solid guys. Pretty solid guys.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's move on to this, and I think we've already touched upon this, but I just want to make sure we cover it. For sure. Is Harry's state of mind. once again, as you've said, he's in high school, does very well, but then eventually when he decides to go to school, maybe a year or two after he graduated high school, maybe things are not going as he planned, at this university. He joined the Marines. Do you think that he was liking that? Um, Now that you think about it now, looking back, then do you think that there might have been a concern that maybe reality was hitting him in the face a little bit? He's so used to doing well at everything, and then he goes to school, doesn't do as well. What do you think about his demeanor? Maybe, of course, this is the summer, so I don't guess he was going to school. Maybe he had off right at the time. But what do you think about his current state of mind in the summer of '84?
You know, I think there was a lot of confusion on his part. Like you said, just the fact that, like I said, he'd always been able to achieve whatever he wanted to, and I do, I know, as he went to school and his grades started slipping, from talking to my mom and dad, they were concerned. They were worried about his drinking, worried about his grades, the typical parent thing, trying to, get him on the right track and do the right thing. So he was, he had the pressure there, and then he had the pressure of, yeah, you're not getting good grades, and things are going bad at school. So I think, at the time that he came up missing or prior to that, yeah, there was a lot of confusion going on with him. I just think there was a lot of, probably, I have always explained it as those young growing pains that we all kind of go through, but I think with him, I think he was one of them guys that wasn't used to that. He was used to, if I want to do something, it's easy for me, school grades and that stuff's easy. And now all of a sudden things are kind of, a little out of control for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. So that was going on. I should have asked you, these other guys who were with him that night, or who you knew were hanging out, all these guys in Albia or Avery or wherever, did any of them go to school with Harry, or did they just stick around town? Do you know?
The last three guys that were with him that night, Jeff, Doug, and Steve, as far as I know, they just hung around Albia. I don't think any of them that I know of ever went to college. None of them were going down to Northeast Missouri. Harry did have a couple high school friends that he knew that were going down there, that he would ride back and forth with and stuff like that, hang out with. So, but those three, no, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Just some questions before we get into what is your understanding about June 30th and into July 1st. As far as you know, any leading up, of course, to June 30th, Harry having any problems with anybody that you've ever heard? Once again, before that day, any problems with anybody, any beefs with anybody, anything like that?
From everything that I've gathered since I came back and started really looking into everything, no. I don't know that he ever had any kind of issues with anybody. Like I said, okay. Harry was just one of them guys that seemed to always get along with everybody. Okay. I know, looking back, hindsight, I know there's a note in the case file that I have about him having an altercation with somebody the weekend before. Said something about him and a friend got in maybe an altercation or a little fight over a basketball team or something. Probably arguing over sports or something. Which I've never been able to confirm or deny that, but that would be the only thing that I've heard or seen of him having any problem with anybody. Do
you know if it was any of the guys that were with him that night that he just?
I have no. I haven't been able to. I've never been able to find out who it was. I've put it out there and tried to ask, and nobody wants to own up or say, "Hey, yeah, it was me." I don't know.
Okay, very good. Once again, we're going to talk about this night in particular, but your understanding this night that Harry was out, common for him to go to Albia and doing the things that he was doing that night? Would you say that this was a common night compared to all the other nights that he used to hang out and do whatever?
Oh yeah, typical night in Albia. 3,000 people. That's what we did. You booze cruised and looked for the parties, or you went to some of the local bars and hung out a little bit. And back then you scooped the loop in your car and done all that stuff. So yeah, I think
Just
as far as
around.
just cruising around, hanging out, and trying to be with your friends and looking for something to do.
All right. We have to remember that at the time of Harry's disappearance, he was 21 years old. Okay. Let's move up to June 30th, 1984. What is your understanding about Harry's movements that day? Maybe did he have a summer job or something, in Avery or in Albia and go out? What is your understanding about his movements from, the afternoon of that day into the next day and who he was with, where he was? What is your understanding?
That's been the hardest thing to try to piece together. I mean, my best understanding of that night is, Harry worked earlier in the day. He worked for an individual by the name of Steve Maddie, Peyton Houses, which is Doug Maddie's older brother. Harry hung out at their house quite a bit. He was good friends with Steve and his wife Darlene. Stayed out there quite a bit, painted houses. He had painted a house. From a very good friend said she saw him at about 3 o'clock that afternoon when he was finishing up painting houses. And then I understand that from there he went home, to change clothes, clean up, do all that stuff. Had some conversation with my mom. My mom said he seemed to be in a good mood. She was apparently wanting to lay some carpet in a room or something, and he had told her that he'd help her, the next day or whatever when he got home. And then he took off for town. Now that's kind of where things start to go foggy, I guess, for me. And what I say by that is, I know he went back to town. For a long time it went from Harry leaving home to being dropped off in his car at 4:45 in the morning.
On July 1st.
About the years, kind of pieced more things together and got more people to maybe talk or put out there what they know. I believe at some point he went to the local bar there, called the Waterworks. Was involved in a card game there. From rumor has it, he won a considerable amount of money. Anywhere from $300 or $400 to $2,000. And most people know that this bar was known for some high stakes poker games. It was also known for a lot of drug activity and was probably in Albia. There was a handful of bars back then. But it was probably the rougher one. It was the one where, not too many outsiders went there and caused any problems because, they knew what was probably going to happen to them, so he went there, supposedly got in this card game and won a bunch of money.
And we're talking about a card game. It sounds to me like this wouldn't have been out like right in the bar. Would this have been like in some back room somewhere? Because I'm guessing that maybe cards and that amount of money is maybe
and that's
found
usually
upon.
and that's how they had it set up there. I mean, you had your main bar area, the bar, and then kind of off to the side in the back. It was an open room where you could see who was back there and that type of thing, but it wasn't, right out in the middle of the bar where they was playing. They was usually the card games were off to themselves. And he supposedly won, a pretty good chunk of change there. It was, late afternoon, early evening part. Left there at some point. I have no idea who with. Nobody's ever said, "Hey, I was with him." I've tried to piece together, who was all in the card game, and I've got different names, throughout the years of who was involved in the card game. But he left the card game. One of the big, I guess, before I get too far, one of the biggest things is the owner of the bar was involved in the card game, is what I'm being told, and that individual's kind of been known over the years that. He didn't like to lose, and a lot of times he would always try to get his money back at some point. So, but off of that, like I say, we'll get back to that later. But he left there, and from that till being dropped off in the morning, I pieced a few things together throughout the night that he was maybe in an apartment right close to where the bar is, by the library where he was last seen, actually. Maybe at a party there. He was at a party there, and I know, at that time I was told that Jeff Adler and Doug Maddie were there with him. They've never said that or never, never said anything. But the eyewitnesses put him there. Another eyewitness has him. We had what's called it's Benton Avenue East, but it's the main Dragon Alley. It's where everybody cruised. You cruised up and down the loop all night and that type of thing. And somewhere around 8, 9 o'clock, somewhere in there, maybe a little later, an eyewitness puts him getting stopped by one of the local police officers across from this car wash that was on there. So he has contact with the officer, goes on about his business from there. The eyewitness says, hey, I think that I know Jeff Adler was with him. I think the other guy was Doug Matty, but that's still never been confirmed. 10 o'clock at night.
If I could just jump in here for a mark, being that we know that of course, we just talked about these guys, Jeff and the rest of them, that they were out that night. Am I then to understand that Harry was like out by himself, or was he actually out with these guys? Which is it?
Yeah, that's the whole question. It sounds like, from trying to piece everything together, the best that I can, there was a lot of being with people and then not with people. So and if you go back and I know we ain't got that far yet, but if you look at Jeff Adler and Doug Matty later on, when they're talked to about Harry's disappearance, they don't even say they're with him until after 2 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
So which is kind of odd,
Well, I don't know. I don't know if it's odd or not. I guess what I'm asking you is, did Harry go out that night with other people, or didn't he?
I don't know.
Okay. All right. Okay.
I mean, I think when he left, it's back to that 21-year-old days. I think when he left home, I don't think, or it didn't seem that he had a plan to say, hey, I'm going to go meet these guys and hang out and do this. Okay. I think it was just kind of one of them fly by the seat of your pants things, because, even like I say, getting stopped by an officer at 8, 9 o'clock at night, I know at 10:20 he stops and talks to another friend of his, and Harry's by himself with a cooler full of beer in the car. So whether he dropped him off somewhere at a party and is now, cruising back around to find something else to do or whatever, I don't know. But, the very good friend says, hey, I know it was 10:20 at night. I have to be at work at 10:30. I came down the steps of my apartment, to go to my car. Harry pulled up, said, hey, hop in. I got a cooler of beer. Let's go party. And the guy's named Darwin Thomas. He said, I told him I can't. Harry said, 50 times before I'd have went with him. He said, a lot of times Harry'd catch me like that and I'd jump in and skip work and go on. But he said, I knew, my job was kind of on the line. And he said, I told him no, and I said, I got to go to work. So he said he drove off and I went and got my car and went on to work out at the hospital. So I know at 10:20, he was at this specific location right near the square in Albia. Okay. Now, after 10:20 at night, I have no clue.
All right. So it's the details are, and we're going to get, but we'll just maybe go into this right now. So, but we should know, though, the listeners and viewers should know that these guys, once again, who are these friends that we've already talked about, though later, they said that some, like you've already said it, like 4 a.m. or something, at least a couple of them insist that yes, they saw Harry and he was in his car by himself and he was driving out of Albia. Did they eventually say that?
Well, yeah. Well, let me put it all in context to be exact. What the 3 individuals say, Jeff, Doug, and Steve, they say after 2 o'clock in the morning, at some point, all 4 of them were riding around in Steve Rockwell's car drinking beer. That they got a 6-pack of beer. They decided to cruise around, and somewhere between 4:30-ish, basically 4 to 4:30-ish, they say they pulled up to the library, which is right around the corner from the Waterworks bar where Harry had been earlier. They pulled up at the over by the library there where Harry's car was parked, and that Steve Rockwell let Jeff Adler and Harry out of the car to get into their cars. Where he dropped Doug off, he never does say. Doug's story's kind of completely, we'll have to talk about that later because it's completely different. But
Okay.
I dropped them two guys off. I pulled away, watched them get into their car. I saw Harry drive north, which would have been toward Avery, where we lived, to go that way. I saw him go north toward Avery and turn back east to go to the main road to go to Avery, and that's the last anybody's ever saw of him, and that's what they said originally.
Okay, and we'll get all right. So that's what they said originally, and if their stories changed, we'll come back to it. Okay, so that's kind of the story at the time in 1984.
Yep.
When do your family, start realizing, you know what, Harry didn't come home. We think something's up. What goes on? I guess later it would be on July 1st. You've already stated that your mother called you, and you're in the Marines at the time. Why don't you explain what went on later that day of July 1st when Harry didn't come home?
The big thing that probably set everything into motion of starting to worry is on July 1st. It was July 4th weekend in Albia, and one of the big things that they have in Albia a lot of times on July 4th weekend is softball tournaments. Harry was a big softball player. A couple of these guys, Jeff Adler, Doug Matty, him, a few of his other buddies, they had a softball team they played on. And Harry was kind of in charge of it. He had the equipment. He kind of ran the team. So Sunday morning, July 1st, they were supposed to play in a softball game at like 11 o'clock. They had a tournament that day. It didn't start till like noon or 1, but they had some makeup game from the softball league they was in. Harry had told everybody that, hey, you need to be there at 11 o'clock. Don't miss it. I worked hard to get this rescheduled. So we got this softball game Sunday morning. So, of course, when my mom at 9 o'clock in the morning, one of Harry's good friends that he went to college with and was down at college with him, Denny Hollenring, calls our house at 9 o'clock in the morning and says, hey, Harry told me to call there to make sure he's up for the softball game. Well, my mom goes and checks and no Harry. He hadn't come home. First instinct was, okay, he just partied. He didn't make it home. No big deal. At some point, she starts calling around to, I think she called Darlene Maddie or Darlene Maddie, called their place to see if they'd seen Harry. I think maybe called Jeff Adler's to see if they'd seen Harry. Nobody'd seen Harry. And then, of course, when he don't show up at the softball game, then everybody starts thinking, okay, what, is Harry, did he wreck his car? Did he do whatever? So that kind of started things into motion. They went out and drove around. It sounds like initially kind of looked for him, my mom and dad, and that went out and drove the route home and those type of things to see if maybe he'd wrecked his car or something like that. She had called later on that evening. She calls me and says, hey, Harry didn't show up for, softball game. We heard him. Nobody's seen him, and I'm 18. I didn't know what the hell to think. I pretty much did that same thing. Like I said earlier, he'll be all right. He's just off partying somewhere. He'll sober up and come home, at some point, and it won't be a big deal. Well, 3 or 4 days later, I'm sitting in California, don't even really know what's going on. And next thing I know, my first sergeant in the Marines calls down to our shop where I'm at and says, hey, you need to come up to my office. So I get up to his office and he tells me, hey, go pack your bags. Go get all your shit together. I've got a ticket for you to fly home. I've got everything set up to get you to the airport. You're going to go home. Your mom and dad called here and your brother still hasn't come home and nobody can find him. Wow. So they sent me home, put me on orders back here to the recruiting station. I came home for 55 days. And at that point is when I think, when like I said earlier, the people that were with him that say they dropped him off, everybody assumed they're friends. They're good friends. Yeah. Why would they lie about anything? So
let me, Mark, let me just jump in here for a second. Let me just ask you this, and I'm not sure if you said this or not. These guys that were allegedly with him or that night before or earlier in that morning. Were any of them going to be playing softball that day too?
Yes, Jeff Adler and Doug Matty, as far as I know, showed up. There that morning to play softball.
Okay.
Steve Rockwell, he didn't play softball. He worked. I believe maybe he worked at a local gas station there and stuff. I think he had went to work. I at some point that morning. So yeah, I mean they were there as far as I know.
Okay.
And like I said,
all right. So they were there, and Harry wasn't. And I'm guessing, that, of course, once again, the story in 1984, we know what it was, is that they saw him get in his car and drive off. And their understanding was that, 5 hours from then or 6 hours from them, they would be seeing Harry at the softball field.
Right, exactly.
Okay. So how soon were the police called in? What did they do? Who did they talk to? Did they question these friends? We've already mentioned this, and we're going to get into a little later, but did anything come up about this poker game or, any of this? In the police work that was done originally at the time, how much was done, if any?
Well, my mom initially reported him as missing on July 1st. That evening, later on that evening when, nobody'd heard from him, nobody'd seen him, that's when she initially made the report. So that was July 1st. To my knowledge, the first time anybody was talked to by the police was on July 3rd, which was they went and talked to, of course, Jeff Adler, Doug Matty, Steve Rockwell. I think they even got a hold maybe of Denny Hallrink, is what would have been considered Harry's best friend, and talked to them and gathered information from them, which was basically, like I said, hey, we rode around. We seen him after 2:00 in the morning. We rode around for a while, drank a few beers, dropped him off his car, and he drove off into the darkness. Okay. And that was it.
Let me ask you this: being that the police got involved on July 3rd, did anything come up regarding Harry getting pulled over on June 30th? You've already discussed this. Did that ever appear in any of the paperwork? When they were looking into Harry's disappearance, do we even know why? Did the police ever find out why Harry got pulled over in the first place? Any of that? Did that come up?
No. There. Like I say, the only statements that ever came out of anything was those three statements of rode around, dropped him off, and he left. Most of that information, like I was including in the timeline there earlier, is things I've learned over time. From talking to different individuals. There was no mention. I guess that's what's so strange to me with the statements and the investigation or whatever you want to call it by the police at that time. Nobody ever included anything after 2:00 in the morning and where they were at or what they were doing anytime that day. Everything started for them, it seems like, at 2:00 in the morning, and it's that just this car ride around. I understand the mindset of thinking friends, and nobody did anything to Harry. So I just don't think they never, that was not even a consideration. I think they instantly went to Harry has probably crashed his car somewhere.
Okay.
All
right.
Or he went to by the third or the fourth, okay, now he's not come home. It's obviously maybe not I went to a party somewhere and got too drunk and passed out and, I'm going to come home tomorrow or whatever. So I think we got past that part of it, by the third. So I think that was just the next step in their mind was he crashed his vehicle. We need to, see if we can find his car somewhere.
Right. We have to remember, if it's not clear to the listeners and viewers, that not only is Harry missing, but his car is missing. And that's still true to this day. Okay.
Yep, exactly.
All right. Any searches done? I've done, and I'm going to do a YouTube video for a map analysis for Harry's disappearance just to kind of show this area and some of these places we're talking about during this interview. But, there are some lakes, I guess you could call them, or retention ponds or whatever. I don't know how it looked in 1984. I can only look at the Google satellite views now.
Right.
But were any of these ponds searched once again at the time? Anything done like that by anybody?
Initially, I know, the Iowa State Patrol was called in. They took up their plane and they flew, the area, the county, looking for his car from the air and didn't have any luck. I know if you take the primary route coming out of Albia, going out to our home in Avery, 6 miles away, there's a couple ponds along that route. There's one that's always been in question, which is probably a mile or two outside of Albia, kind of going northeast toward Avery, where the road comes and makes a nice, pretty decent curve, and there's a pond sitting right there, a pretty large pond. That pond initially I was told was searched with radar, or sonar. Back then, there's some documentation of that, but it's not real clear. But they said they had searched it. I know since then, there's been multiple places searched. I mean, all the main bodies of the water around here, the Albia Reservoir, Country Club, the Lake Miami, the primary bigger bodies of water around Monroe County and Albia have been searched. In the last year or two, at least. So with a lot higher tech stuff, of course. And they searched that pond again, kind of ruled it out. I ruled that pond out, probably day one when I got home. I mean, because that was my first thought. Okay, he come around there drinking, high speed, whatever, lost control of his car and went off into the pond. Well, Harry had a 1977 Grand Prix. The thing's as big as a house, I went there, and to actually get into the pond, I mean, you'd have had to been literally flying, but there's also a fence line. I mean, this is rural Iowa. There's a, cattle fence there and everything else, and it's all grass leading to the pond. My first instinct was to go there and look. There was no skid marks. There was no indentations in the ground, no holes in the fence. There was absolutely nothing to say a car had ever went off of there and went anywhere near this pond. So, I guess in my mind, I kind of said, well, that's probably a pretty good impossible thing to do, but that's always been the first thing that everybody, wants to talk about is, oh, did they check this pond? Well, it's been checked. So that's where we started at that point, was just literally, I know when I came home, I drove every route I could get to get home. And then after I didn't find him there, then we just, basically was driving the entire county, looking in ditches, looking in ravines, looking everywhere to find this humongous size car that he drove, and
let me ask you this, being that they were drinking, do you believe that Harry was drinking and driving that night? Do you believe he was maybe over the limit to be driving?
From their statements, they said, the guys had said that he'd been drinking, but he wasn't. They didn't think he was drunk, or they did. I think one of them's even comment was, "Well, I've seen him worse before," So was he drinking? Yeah. Was he intoxicated? I don't know. Probably a good chance of it. At 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, if that's truly the case, that you drank pretty much from 4 in the afternoon or 5 in the afternoon throughout the entire day to 4 o'clock in the morning.
I guess that the listeners are going to get the idea that probably he was over the limit. So I guess this is something, once again, there seems to be some doubt about these people's stories. That's good. It's always up for the audience to determine whether these people are telling the truth. But if they are telling the truth, I got to say that I'm leaning toward the idea maybe that Harry shouldn't have probably been driving that night, probably on the way home.
Probably not.
Would that be a fair statement?
I think it'd be a fair statement. You bet.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to this. So with all this is done, at the time, once again, in 1984, did any of those friends ever offer up, being that a couple of them showed up to the softball game that next day or later that day, and Harry wasn't there, Did these guys at the time ever offer up their own theories as to what could have happened to Harry, being that they were friends with him and knew him so well? Do you know if they ever offered up a theory at the time?
Those three guys never did.
No.
I mean, there was no, pretty much they stuck to the story of we dropped him off and in their statements, they talked about some different things of, at one point when they were supposedly riding around, Harry wanted to go to Ottumwa, which is a town like 20 miles away. A lot of times when at those times of the morning, I know when I was younger, that was a place if you wanted to go eat breakfast, you'd take off road crews down there, eat breakfast, and then come back home. But they said that they didn't go there. But no, nobody ever, really came up with any theories until a little bit later on, and then there was some talk by a college roommate that.
All right, we'll get into that. I'm just worrying about these guys once again, being that they were allegedly the last people to see Harry. It's always interesting to me whether we believe these people or not. Either way, if they ever offered up their own theory, being that they were there, whether we believe their story or not, they're the ones who are friends with Harry. They were out that night too. Have they ever offered up a theory? And the answer is no. Okay. No. All right, let's move on to this. Now, this is the rest of the case. Now, something that maybe the listeners need to know right now is that you became a police officer, correct?
Yes, I spent 22 years as a police officer.
All right, and you, where were you a police officer?
I was a police officer for 9 years in Albia, Iowa. I started my career in Albia. I went all the way up to the position. At one point I was assistant chief and even served as acting chief a couple times, over my 9 years that I was there. After that, money wise, I moved to a bigger Ottumwa, a bigger 25,000 people community and became an officer there for another 12 years while I was there, which I did just about everything there, everything from patrol. I was a detective for a while. I was a patrol sergeant, and I did 7 years of undercover narcotics work. So I kind of did a realm of everything. Even when I was in Albia, I had a drug dog for a long time. So I know the ins and outs of law enforcement pretty well.
All right, so let me ask you this. Being that you were actually eventually on the Albia Police Department, is that the department that is still responsible for Harry's disappearance in 2022?
Actually, they're not. It's the Monroe County Sheriff's Department that works in the same. I mean, they work in the same building. You got the city PD does just the city of Albia, where Monroe County Sheriff, they do the whole county, which includes some of the other little, like Avery, where I lived, and La Villa, Melrose, the other little towns outside of Albia. But the case initially, even though Harry technically, I guess, was last seen in the city limits of Albia, because we lived in the county and my mom filed the report, from home, basically it was instantly a Monroe County case.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that clarification. And what years did you work for the Albia Police Department?
I worked there 95 through, I think it was 2000. Well, it would have been 9 years later. Whatever.
All right, 2004. Okay.
Yeah, something like that. All right,
so
when I left there.
So you started there 11 years after Harry went missing. Okay, so we're going to get into that a little bit later. I just thought that was the proper point to talk about that before we get into some of these other things. All right, let's get into some of these things. And as listeners know and viewers know, we use an outline for all of these interviews. So the next thing I want to talk about, I want to go back to that call that was made on July 1st regarding Harry going to the softball game. I'm guessing your mother picked up the phone. Did this person who called to wake, I guess, Harry up or something to make sure he got to the softball game, did this guy sound surprised that Harry was not there when he called? And did this guy ever say, well, you know what, did he ever offer up any comment, being that he was not out with them? What has this guy said about his call and all of that? What can you say?
Well, the call itself, I mean, I don't know. My mom never really said if he sounded surprised or not surprised. Mm-hmm. I would assume probably not, just for the fact that, that was, typical 21-year-old behavior back then. Oh, well, yeah, he's supposed to be home, but yeah, we were out partying last night and he didn't make it home. So I mean, nothing was really ever said about that. The strange thing with the individual that made the call, he did give a statement on, I believe, the third, like the other guys, or at some third or the fourth, right there. At some point, he in that statement says that Harry was pretty adamant of explaining to everybody that they needed to be at that ball game the next morning. So the strange part I see in that is like we've talked, the contact with Harry, or the people that had contact with Harry that night, seemed to be very minimal, but here's this guy that says Harry talked to everybody and told them to be at the ball game. So that's at least 10 players or 9 other players on a softball team that at some point during the night you talked to. Denny Hollenrink was Harry's best friend. I mean, literally through high school. They were roommates in college for a while. I mean, where pretty much everybody knew wherever Harry was, there was Denny, and of course, Denny had a girlfriend, a gal by the name of Michelle. So the three of them spent a lot of time together, it seemed like. And Harry had another friend named Stacy that he was real good friends with. So, it was just kind of a weird makeup. But to get back to where I was going, Denny was his roommate in college. When things were going south for Harry a little bit in college with the grades and everything, I've had 2 conversations with Denny, I believe, since Harry's been missing. And one of them, I asked him, I said, okay, and this was not too long ago. I asked him, I said, why did you and Harry, you're best friends? That's like a dream going to college. You're rooming with your best friend, you're partying, you're having a good time. He said, well, we had some disagreements and we weren't, we felt like because we were spending so much time goofing off and doing stuff, we needed to separate as roommates. So they separated as roommates.
Has he ever offered up his own theory on what happened to, you and I are not going to theorize, but if any of his friends have ever said anything, being that they knew him and around the area, has Denny ever said anything about his own idea of what happened to Harry?
Denny has never said that to me, never come out and, made any kind of theories. I know at some point, the thing that's probably caught me really strange is he did do, and I'd have to look and see exactly, but he did an interview for, I think, one of the local papers, back when all this was going on. And one of the, somebody, I think one of the reporters, and I know sometimes reporters can get things wrong from what somebody says, but I just thought it was strange that in one of the papers, it comes right out and says, where Denny says, well, Harry's dead.
I see.
And it's like, okay, I mean, that's, not even it's almost like you're making a statement rather than, like you say, making a theory or an opinion. It's like you're saying he's dead. And it's like, so, I mean, he's never really said much to me. He's definitely an odd character now. I mean, the Denny I knew back when he was running with Harry and the Denny that I hear about and know now, completely 2 different people,
Okay.
I mean, so.
All right, let's move on to this. All right, so we have this guy who called that morning, still has not offered up his own theory, even though he was best friends with Harry, and you've talked to him twice, and one of those times even very recently. Yep. Let's move on to this. We've already talked about this poker game. Just very quickly, as besides this Mike Stalker guy, has anybody else ever been identified as playing poker with Harry that night? Have you or the county or the sheriff's office ever been able to track down anybody who's also playing poker that night?
Let me backtrack. And I hate to do that. As far as the poker game, for probably 10 or 15 years, nobody ever even knew of a poker game.
Wow.
That's something that's come to light over the years of looking into it. So that's where, if you go back to like the original 3 guys and how I said, they only offered up 2:00 in the morning to 4:30 in the morning. We dropped him off. He drives off into the darkness. They never talk about where they were beforehand, anything like that. So for years, you know, and I know a lot of viewers, because I mean, following my Facebook page and the different things that I've done, you know, that's always the confusion that they want to jump on law enforcement. Oh, you know, law enforcement failed. In a way they did, but not quite the way that some of them see it, because they failed by not asking the right questions to begin with. You know, I guess that's the way I look at it, is when Harry was missing for a week, a month, you know, 6 months, nobody went back and tried to do anything. You know, I mean, they really didn't follow anything. So 10 years later, when the bar story starts coming out and the poker game story, you know, everybody's like, well, why didn't they go talk to these people? Well, they didn't know.
How does news about a poker game just come out of thin air after 10 years? Being that then about that time you were starting to work for the Albia Police Department, how did that just pop out of nowhere?
A lot of that just rumor mill, you know, putting pressure. I mean, you know, for a long time, like I say, for 7 years, I was gone in the Marine Corps. So you know, everything was done by my mom and dad. You know, they would constantly, you know, check in with law enforcement and ask, hey, anything new? They'd get told no. You know, I mean, basically, nope, we don't know any more than we did, you know, the last time you asked. Once I was back here permanently out of the Marine Corps and that stuff, and it got a little wiser in my years, and then becoming an officer, I started using the press. You know, every year I would, you know, try to get the newspaper to put an article in there, or, you know, we didn't have, you know, and that's what's so great about now, and guys like you and other people, you know, having the use of social media and YouTube and all these platforms out there is a godsend for somebody like me, because I didn't have that back then. There, you know, I put something in the paper on the anniversary of him missing, you know, and maybe get a few people talking to me about things, you know, and until the social media started, it was hit and miss. And that's kind of where the card game, the name started coming up. You know, hey,
do you even know who first brought that up?
You know, to tell you the truth, you know, there was a guy, Kelly Wilkins, that told me and that's been fairly recent, but I think it was more of the name Mike Stalker came out, you know, more than anything. And I think that was some of the reputation. And then there was talk of Harry maybe being in the bar, you know, and then, you know, here not too long ago, Kelly Wilkins, a guy that, you know, believe it or not, we were arch enemies when I was on the police force, you know, at one time. I mean, he's from that side, you know, the drug side of things. I was the cop side of things, but we had a mutual respect, and he heard about the story. And then he says, hey, Mark, he gets a hold of me and says, send me some messages. Hey, Mark, I know this story about, you know, this night, you know, a card game and the owner of the bar and two guys taking Harry, you know, somewhere, which kind of got things snowballing. So it's just kind of been hit and miss over the years, you know, and I couldn't tell you exactly where each of those all came from right off the top of my head. I mean, I got, you know, miles and miles and miles of messages and notes and stuff like that. But, you know, that's kind of where that came into it, you know, and that's where Stalker's name come into it, being the bar owner. Then people come to me and start telling me about him and his temper and the fact that, you know, he was known to, you know, follow guys later and beat them down and get his money back and stuff like that. And he run with a pretty rough crowd, you know. I mean, it was a bar that was moving a lot of dope back in the day. So, you know, to tell you exactly how all that came in, I don't know exactly, but you know, that's always been looking at it back through Pop's eyes, I guess. When I start looking back to the three guys that gave the last statement, to me, that's a very big clue when none of the three of you will even put yourself anywhere. You know, you don't want to put yourself at a bar. You don't want to put yourself at any of the bars in town, a party or anything like that. You just want to say, us four riding in a car, dropped him off, he left. That's all we know. Okay. You know,
I guess what they're saying, and I'm sure once again, you are the person with the police officer experience that, a story just comes out of nowhere after 11 years or however. And that Harry was allegedly in this bar, but over that time, how many people could have been in that bar? How many people were at that poker game? And then surely some of those people knew that Harry went missing, that nobody ever came forward to say, I saw Harry in that bar last night, and it took 11 years for that to happen. That scene, I have to admit, I hear these stories a lot, and I just wonder a lot of times whether they're true or not.
Right. Oh, sure. And that's back to, I use Darwin Thomas, for example. I've known Darwin my whole life. He was very good friends, even with my parents, very good friends with Harry. I mean, he was great friends with my parents later on in the years. It was just maybe in the last 2 years, that I found out that he saw Harry that night. And I'm like, okay, when I went to him, and you got to know Darwin, he's about as genuine as you can ever get. I mean, this guy right now, he's in really bad shape. He got in an accident, and, prayers for him that he's doing good. But I heard about it through rumors that, hey, Darwin might have seen Harry that night. Well, I go and I find Darwin and we have a conversation and I said, Darwin, why didn't you tell anybody this 30 years ago? He's like, nobody asked. He said, I sat around waiting for the cops or somebody to come investigating and ask, and he said, I just figured it wasn't important. I figured they didn't think it was important because nobody had ever asked, and that's what I've run into a lot of. I've had a lot of people that will, years later spit out some little bit of, just like I say, in Harry being at this apartment building and being seen with Jeff Adler and Doug Matty. Same thing. Didn't find that out till a couple of years ago because you have the ease of social media and easier to communicate. Gal gets a hold of me and goes, oh, Mark, I don't know how Jeff Adler and Doug Matty can say they weren't with Harry that night because I saw him. And I saw him here. And I'm like, why didn't you tell me that before? I thought you knew that. So, I think there's been a whole lot of that. I thought you knew, maybe you knew, or just, if you go back outside of the social media, cell phone era that we have now, the communication just wasn't there, unless somebody come around and ask you, you didn't go, I know even when I was young, you didn't go to the police station for nothing unless you were asked to. So
okay.
I think that was a lot of it.
All right, let's move on to this. Now, regarding this money that he alleged, once again, I don't know what, the listeners will make their own decisions. I don't know whether I'm supposed to believe this poker game and all these things or not. But is it also possibly true that he had gotten a paycheck from maybe the Marine reservist or somewhere that he could have cashed? So he might have had that money on top of this other money. Is that a story as well?
So far, yeah, that's I learned that from his roommate down at college. After he moved out with Denny, he moved in with an individual named Brian Williams. He was in my grade in school, was a friend of mine in school, and he told me, he said Harry was having issues. He's the one who started the whole, Harry talked about going to Alaska maybe and starting all over type of story. But he's the one at the same time told me that, Harry was in a real good mood when he came home that weekend because he had got his check from the Marines from being in boot camp and it got that money. So, so far, can I confirm that from the military? No. Getting records from the military right now is like pulling teeth. I've got submissions in and got people working on everything, trying to get all of the records from the military. But with COVID and all that good stuff, it seems like it's just dragging on forever.
Okay. All right. So once again, we have the story that the roommate from college says that Harry got this other money. So maybe that was the money that he used to actually go play in this poker game, like the buy-in or something. Or, we just don't know. But, I guess what we're saying is maybe we can see a scenario where he did get jumped because of the money that he had on him. Let's just say
right.
that. Let's move on to this. Now, we've, of course, talked a lot about these friends and whether they're telling the truth or not and everything, but I want to keep this very simple. In your opinion, do their stories sync up? Meaning, do each of their individual stories, looking at them one by one, are there any contradictions between them? For example, maybe a contradiction would be that Jeff said that, I saw Harry drive south, and one of the others said, no, I saw Harry drive north. Are there any contradictions that they've told you or anybody else about this time that they saw Harry that early morning?
Yeah. Like I said, if you go by the first statements they gave, in July 3rd time frame, July 3rd, July 4th, their stories were fairly consistent. 10 years later, to kind of sum it up, the sheriff that was the sheriff of Monroe County that handled the case initially and did the investigation would have been the guy that took the initial statements and all that stuff, him or one of his deputies. He later retired, or not retired, but changed jobs, went to a job in Des Moines, still in law enforcement, working for the state, started his own private investigating business. Very good friend of my mom and dad's, very good friend of mine. He always tried to continue to find out information about the case. He'd put things in the paper saying to contact him. He worked as a private investigator, basically, pro bono for my mom and dad, because it just always bugged him because it was his case. Well, 10 years after Harry was missing in 94 time frame, he did go back and interview Jeff Adler. He went back and interviewed Doug Matty, and he interviewed Steve Rockwell at one point. I think Rockwell's was a little bit later, but he did talk to him at some point. And at that point, the stories, in my opinion, changed considerably, especially Jeff Adler. At one point, the story was they were all in Rockwell's car, got dropped off, and Harry drove away. Well, if you go back and look at his statement 10 years after the fact, he says he's got a very limited memory. He says we were in Harry that Harry dropped him off over there at his car, and it's like, wait a minute, you said originally you were in Jeff Adler's car. So there's a lot of inconsistencies there in that last, few hours, I guess, within the statements. Doug Matty, he tries to say that, I was at home I was out at my girlfriend's place till 2 a.m. I come in and he clearly says I was only with him for maybe 15 to 30 minutes. Okay, well, how were you only with him 15 to 30 minutes? If you come into town after 2 o'clock and they're dropping him off at 4:30 in the morning, and you say you were the last one out of the car, by the, somewhere near the front of the bar and not over by the library. So, there's just a lot of different inconsistencies. There's a lot of inconsistencies like in Rockwell's, if you try to put a map to the original stories of where they dropped him off at to what he says later, Steve has always stayed close to my family. He always talked to my mom and dad when I was gone. He's talked to me a few times. Even recently when I got the case reopened, he come to me not shortly after that, said, "Hey, I need to talk to you." Jeff Adler lied that night about his times, and we kind of lied about Doug Matty. We didn't want everybody to know Doug Matty was with us, because he's trouble. Well, back then he wasn't really much trouble compared to what he is nowadays. So I think he's kind of mixing things up there. And then he went into telling me a story about, hey, the biggest thing that just bothers me about the whole Harry thing is I remember dropping him off that night. And after I dropped him off, I went to pull away and I saw Harry's taillights go north and then turn back to the west to go to the main street. He said, I just can't get that out of my head. He said, he said, I wake up at night seeing these taillights in my mind sometimes. If you go read his last statement that he gave to Denny Carr, he talks about pulling up there from what would have been the south. So he's facing north, drops him off and says he backed out onto the main street, which is Benton, and then went to the east on Benton. So at no point, no way, no how, if that's the story, did you ever see Harry's taillights in your rearview mirror? You know, so I mean, it's just all these little bitty things that, you know, leads me to believe that the whole dropping off at his car story is nothing but a make-believe story.
Fiction.
I mean, it's a made-up
okay,
story.
So I guess the answer to the question is there are inconsistencies. These people's stories don't all line up.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the whole question now. You know, is
okay.
What's the truth and what's not? You know.
Okay. Let's move on to this, and I think this will be fitting given that you were a police officer in Albia for 9 years. And Mike Stalker, of course, in his bar was or is in Albia. Did you ever have a chance to run into Mike? And in fact, do you even have a story involving someone who, when you arrested this person, claimed that he knew what happened to Harry and he would never tell you? Maybe we can talk about that all in one group. First, regarding Mike Stalker / Mike, he also goes by the last name Kraus. He's deceased now. But do you ever have a chance to run into him? Did you know about him firsthand from your work being a police officer in Albia?
I mean, I always knew what the bar was about. Once I became an officer over there, I think that I don't know that the bar was still really going at that time. The interesting thing about Mike Klaus or Mike Stalker is he not long after Harry come up missing, he left Albia. I mean, completely packed up, left Albia, went to Arizona to a friend's out there, stayed out there for for a few years. Then he went on to California where he met the gal that he married and had a couple kids with, come back to Albia. You know, at that time, the bar wasn't around or anything. And like I say, during those time frames, you know, I didn't know all the information I know now, you know, so yeah, I never had an opportunity to go talk to him. Even if that would have been the case, I probably wouldn't have. You know, I made it pretty clear in the information that I put out. When I was an officer, I tried to avoid having anything to do with the case other than if people gave me information, I passed it on to who I thought needed to know and assumed that they were doing something with it. You know, because I didn't ever want to have that conflict of interest of I'm using my power or my authority to try to manipulate things or do things. So I just always felt it was probably the best interest just to pass it on to somebody else. I know at one point, you know, Mike Stalker, like you said, he's deceased. He, I don't know what he passed away from, but he had something that unfortunately ended his life early. But I know at one point there was an officer that was supposed to go, a deputy was supposed to go talk to him before he died. You know, the deputy told me, he said, I just never got around to it, you know? So, I never really, I mean, I had contact younger when I was 18, 19, coming back out of the Marine Corps, going in and out of the bar. Yeah, I had a lot of contact with Mike back in at that time. But at that time, you know, his name had never came up. So, you know, I just knew his personality. You know, I always thought he was, you know, being a bar owner and knowing the reputation of the bar and what was going on in the bar. He was arrogant and he was a bigger guy. So he, you know, it didn't surprise me to hear stories later on of, you know, maybe him beating somebody down and trying to get his money back, those type of things. He was kind of one of them guys that I always described it as somewhat bipolar. You know, I mean, they'd say it 1 minute you're sitting there and he's perfectly fine, good mood, having a good time. And the next minute, you don't know what's going to happen. You know, I mean, and that could be the drugs and who knows what. But I didn't really have much contact with him that much.
Okay. Let's move on to that story that I just mentioned. Did you, in fact, arrest somebody at some point? And this person's, you know, once again, well, I don't know whether we're supposed to believe this, but you had told me, I thought, that you had arrested somebody and somebody said that, you know, I'm never going to tell you what happened to Harry. Did that happen?
Yeah. I arrested Doug Matty, you know, one of the guys that was last with Harry. Doug, you know, you know, I'm not going to pull no punches. Doug, I feel sorry for him. Like I explained earlier, great guy, when he was younger. Pretty much ever since Harry came up missing, completely spiraled out of control, I believe. Well, I mean, it's simple. Public records out there. Look at his arrest record. He's been arrested for everything under the sun, mostly all narcotics type of stuff. I arrested him on, I believe it was a warrant for manufacturing narcotics or whatever it was. I think that's what it was at the time. Ran into him on the front porch of his house. Me and him literally got in a all-out fight, trying to get him handcuffed and get him arrested. I get him handcuffed. I get him, taking him over to my car. He's hot, and as I'm going to put him in the car, he turns around and looks, he's a foot away from me, looks me right square in the face, and his exact words were, I know exactly what happened to your fucking brother, and I'm never going to tell you.
Oh
So I mean, some people have tried to say, oh, that was just, him trying to get under your skin. I spent 22 years as a cop, and yeah, of course, people try to get under your skin when they're in trouble and they're doing dumb stuff, and they're drunk or high and being stupid. They say things, pig, and this. Nobody says something like that. I never had anything like that, and I truly believe that that's the truth. I think he was mad enough that he told me the truth, and he knew that was the only way that he was really going to try to get under my skin.
Okay. Oh wow, that's a crazy story. Okay, let's move on to this now. Actually, Harry's disappearance, although I'm sure it is still a very big story still to this day in Albia, Iowa. There's also something else that happened in Albia during the year of 1984, and it was an actual murder.
Yep.
Let's just talk about a little bit about that. What are the general details of it? And is anybody, because Albia is not that big of a place, so to have a disappearance that is still unsolved 38 years later, and have a murder that is still unsolved 38 years later that happened in the same year. I don't know if that's some sort of coincidence or something. But what can you say about this murder, whatever you know about it? And has it ever been tried? Has the two ever been tried to be connected?
The murder itself was an individual by the name of Tim Ernie. I think he was like 28 years old. He, at the time, from what I understand, he was messing around, selling a little bit of pot, back then. But other than that, I mean, basically, I didn't know him personally. I didn't know Harry to ever really associate with him. But he was living with a gal that had left her husband, or she was living with him in Albia, I guess I should say. So that's kind of always been the story, for that deal is, it's kind of one of them love triangle deals, and the ex,
Right.
Everybody you talk to around here will tell you, Harold Kempf, the ex-husband, killed Tim Ernie. He made claims many, many times to people that if he ever got the opportunity, he would kill him. So that's, I guess, always been the big rumor or the big truth to that, I guess, that most people want to believe. I believe it. I'm good friends with Tim Ernie's sister now, just because of the Harry and the Tim Ernie. I mean, Ernie came up murdered 5 months before Harry.
Mm-hmm.
And
no connection that you see at all. No connection.
No, I don't. I mean, there's the only people that's ever. I mean, really, there's only been one person that I ever know of that has tried to put the two murders, Harry's disappearance and this murder together. Is one of the local police officers that we had, Larry Jones. He's the only one that ever seems to always, in any thing that he ever had any comment or dealing with, always tried to ask, somebody if they knew these two were associated, or somehow they were both associated together. Ernie's was pretty simple. It sounds like, from what I know, He had dropped his girlfriend, the Kim's ex-wife, off at the school where she worked. He returned home, walked in his house, looked like he went to turn on his TV. Somebody stepped out from somewhere and put 2 small caliber bullets in the back of his head and left. And that's pretty much where it's been. I mean, they did a big investigation, and of course, Harold Kemp was the #1 suspect. They did some search warrants. They interviewed a lot of people, but it's back to the thing that a lot of people don't understand. Smart criminals never talk to nobody, and he was a smart criminal. If he truly did it, he was smart because he got a lawyer right away. Lawyer said, "You're not talking," and he, I know he just passed away recently. So he went on another 38 years living his life and never spoke another word of it. At least on the side that would get him in trouble for it. So I don't think there's any association between the two. But yeah, like you say, it's still really odd that 2 young guys in a town of 3,000 people in the middle of rural Iowa are gone. One's disappeared and one's murdered, and neither one of them gets solved.
Right. Okay. Let's move on to this. Now, this is moving up to very recently that regarding Harry's disappearance was a piece of property dug up. How did this come about? Why was this done? Where was this done? How did that all happen?
The place that's been dug up it's an old trailer park, kind of an old trailer park. And the backside of it was kind of a dumping ground for the guy that owned it. The reason that kind of came up, there was some information that came up, reference that area, reference a guy maybe witnessing some stuff that he believed. He was a kid when it happened, but he thinks he's having memory coming back of different things which involved that property. So law enforcement, they did their investigation, and they went out there and dug up some of the property. From what I know, I mean, they've never really told me exactly what they've done, but I know they dug a few pretty good size areas up looking for his car out there. They didn't find anything at this point. From my understanding, it was getting toward the winter time frame around here, so I don't know for sure. I've heard rumors that they maybe plan on going back out there and doing some more digging. But it involves a family, the Davis family from Monroe County. Basically, it was Richard Davis's property. The Davis name in Monroe County and Albia, back then was pretty associated with drugs and running drugs through Albia. I think that's who, 90% of the drugs were coming into Albia from. There's 4 brothers. One of them is in prison for murder. One of them is still alive. Of course, one's dead. 2 of the brothers were there the night with the card game, and maybe one of them was in the card game. That's kind of how that's all come together, I guess, without getting super detailed and everything.
All right, so maybe there's something there, but these were not people who were mentioned back in 1984. You and all of the work that you had done up until recently, you never heard any of their names mentioned?
No, not originally. No,
okay.
It's just all over the years, a name coming up, and like I say, to describe the type of individuals I'm talking about, like I say, one of them is in prison for murder. Richard Davis is in prison for murder. His brother Gary Davis is who he murdered. He one day decided over an argument. I mean, literally, he was out at the local little cafe and got ready to leave at 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, and a waitress asked him, and I mean, this come out even I think in the trial. Waitress asked him, said, what are you going to do today, Richard? And he said, I'm going to go kill my brother. And he literally left there, drove across town, pulled in his brother's driveway. His brother come out. He got out of the car, shot him dead right in front of the house, and set the gun on front of the car and waited on the cops. So it's just, You know,
we've all
I
had,
mean,
you
could
know, we've
write a
all had
book on
sibling
some of that
problems,
stuff.
but come on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
To go kill your own brother, there's got to be something going on, you know.
Okay. Let me ask you this, and we'll get into maybe. I wanted to, of course, get your opinion as a law enforcement officer on some of these things, just from your point of view. But regarding those friends who seem, maybe let's just say they don't seem to have acted and said things in a way that you think best friends would act, and say. Let's just put it that
Right.
way. Do any of them have access to a place where a person and a car could be disposed of and be hidden for 38 years?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I think all of them do it. Well, two of them own property now where, yeah, they could probably have gotten rid of a car. Yeah.
But back
The
in
third one.
1984, they would have just been 21-year-olds or something.
Oh yeah,
or
exactly.
20-year-olds.
I mean, yeah, no.
I guess that's what I'm asking. But would they have had access anytime at the time in 1984? To something happens and then they figure out, well, we have to do something with Harry and his car. Would they have had access to any place like that?
Not that I know of, right offhand. The only one
Okay.
maybe would have been Doug Matty, with his brother and sister that, out there where Harry stayed. They had a farm, that type of thing. And there's been some question over that property over the years. So that would be the only one I could think of. But no, I mean, I don't, at that particular time, no.
Okay. Let's move on to this. Being that you were a law enforcement officer for many years, looking back at Harry's disappearance and the initial investigation, what do you think are the mistakes that were made? I know we're doing hindsight 2020, but you are a law enforcement officer, and maybe you even filled out a few missing persons reports in your day.
A lot of them.
Yeah. So, what do you look at your brother's disappearance? What were the mistakes that were made back in 1984?
Well, I think the first mistake, is just in general law enforcement. Philosophy is the first thing that caused a lot of the problems. 1984, 2022, two different worlds, as far as how law enforcement does things. I think the biggest downfall Harry had is he was 21 years old, and law enforcement looked at it as he's a grown man. He can go do what he wants, so I think that's the first biggest mistake they made is they never, ever assumed there could have been any foul play. They assumed exactly, I guess as a law enforcement officer, especially looking at a missing persons or anything like that, I learned very quickly never to take what somebody tells me as the gospel truth right out the start. I mean, you always got to kind of look at it with, okay, that's your story, but I'm going to look at more than that. And I don't think they ever did that. I think, like I mentioned earlier, they talked to these guys 3 days after Harry come up missing, roughly, and never talked to them again for 10. No, well, law enforcement is still, as far as I know, never talked to any one of them. Only the sheriff, as a private investigator, went back and talked to them. But nobody ever looked at it from a different perspective other than taking off or wrecking his car. And when they couldn't find that he wrecked his car somewhere, they never went any farther. That's the biggest mistake they made is they didn't go back a week later or 2 weeks later and start questioning and canvassing things and doing the things. Even if you didn't know exactly where Harry was at, it's a town of 3,000 people. It ain't hard to figure out on a Saturday night, where's a 21-year-old? You didn't maybe have to start with the Waterworks bar, but you could have started with all them bars that were in town and started checking with people. Hey, who saw Harry? Where'd you see him? Those type of things. That was the biggest mistake they made and probably the hardest hurdle to overcome now. Because like you mentioned earlier, you got the question of, well, why did they wait this long to say anything? I don't know. Maybe they would have said something a week after or 2 weeks after had law enforcement put it out there that, hey, we're looking at this more than just a guy that drove away.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I mean that's the biggest thing there. The other thing is the other part that it's still back to that same law enforcement is different than it is now. Everything nowadays is documented to a T. I mean, I spent more hours typing on a computer than I did being a cop in my later years because
Right.
everything has got to be just typed out. Now I mean they did I mean even the I have the entire case file of Harry's that was from day one up until December 22nd of last year when um, and it's a mess because there's no computer records. They don't, stuff wasn't put in a computer. It's handwritten notes. It's, stuff that you're looking at. I'm handing to my wife going, what the heck does this say? Trying to decipher things out, doing those type of things. So,
Right. And
the
the
law
listeners should
enforcement was,
know. Yeah, the listeners should know. I've seen some of these notes, these handwritten notes, and they're hard to read.
oh, I mean, it's, I still to this day, there's times when people will look at something and say, well, don't this say this? And I'm like, I got to go back and get them out and look and say, okay, wait a minute, maybe that's what it says, I mean, it's just terrible. It's sad to think that, that's the way it was handled back then. And I think 90% of it starts with being 21, being over the age of 18, being an adult. They never took missing adults serious because they always thought, well, they can do what they want. They can take off. And there was never, in Harry's case, there was never anything to ever say there was any foul play.
Yeah.
I mean, when you got three guys' story and they somewhat sound the same, that's what they went on. That's, I just, it's sad because I know nowadays, when a last missing person report I took as an officer, we had a rule down there. If a name is mentioned or a place is mentioned, you better have it in your report that you went and physically talked to that person and got their story. And if they mention 10 other people, you better go talk to those other 10 people, and you just keep going. And plus nowadays, of course, cell phones, are the greatest thing on the planet when it comes to that. Cause I can get on there and find your cell phone, track you by a tower. And okay, at least now I got a general area to start looking. Back then it was just, let's start with the route toward home and expand out from there. So.
Right. How tough has this been for you and your family since 1984?
Terrible. I mean, my dad, with Harry being adopted, that was, I always, like I said earlier, I know we were raised as brothers and treated pretty much equal, but with my dad, that was, Harry was, he adopted him. He didn't, it wasn't, he chose to get this baby or kid that was born club-footed and take care of him. So he was always treated a little bit different. I mean, there were some things with my dad that I always noticed where he got, a little bit better treatment on some things, but it was horrible. I mean, it was, when you finally realized that, in my mind, it took me a few years to say, okay, he's not missing, he's not run away somewhere and changed his life or done any of that. Something happened to him. I got to that conclusion fairly quickly. I don't think my dad ever did. I mean, he literally, me and my wife talk about it all the time. You couldn't mention his name that the two of them weren't in tears. I mean, you couldn't really have good conversations because the emotions was so, so high. And, he, I mean, he didn't want to, when my mom died, my mom, grandma, whatever, died of cancer, he still lived out in Avery for a long time. He ended up finally moving and remarrying, but for the longest time he wouldn't move away from home. And I'm like, Dad, why don't you move 20 miles to Ottumwa where you spend 90% of your time? Well, I don't want to not be here if Harry comes home. He said, I'm scared if Harry comes home and I'm not here, he'll leave again. So I mean, and then, on top of that, the other thing was the fact of, my dad was a big time Marine. He was kind of one of the oddballs because he was both in the Marines and the Army. He was drafted in the Army. And I don't know if I got him exactly correct, but he was in the Korean War and World War II. So was drafted into one, got out, and then he went in to the other one. So I think it was Army first and then Marine. So, but he was a big time Marine, and and of course with Harry being a Marine Reserve, one of the most heartbreaking things is when you're getting a notice from the Marine Corps and they're telling you that your son's AWOL to begin with, and then they're declaring him a deserter, and it just and that he didn't do this by his choice, or at least that's what he believed, and then to clear it all up, I think it was 91 or 92, to clear up his estate and get everything straight with the military and all that stuff. My dad had to petition the courts to have him declared deceased, Yeah. The toughest thing I ever saw a guy do was get that paperwork in the mail and have to take it, into the courthouse to say that your son's dead, when you don't even know what the truth is.
What happened?
That it was tough, it's tough, and it's still tough. It's tough when you don't have that closure. I'm used. People in my life have died. My parents have died. Everything else, I've had, family members die. Yeah, it's rough, but you know what happened. You know where they're at. You know the circumstance. And to be in a situation where you just don't know, it's kind of hard to describe.
Do you think? Of course, it's tough for all the family members who are guests, but do you think it's especially difficult considering? I'm guessing not only you, but maybe other people in your family, maybe your parents, technically your grandparents. Suspect these friends. Once again, I don't know what to think. It's up to the listeners to decide for themselves. But obviously, there is a tone in this interview where you have a suspicion that these friends who you thought were good guys, they aren't telling you the total truth. Has that obviously made it even more difficult?
Oh yes, that's probably the more difficult thing to deal with. Is I understand that in my opinion, something happened to Harry. Do I believe that one of those three guys hurt Harry? I don't. I guess deep down, I don't really think they did. I don't know for sure, but I don't think they did. I just think maybe they saw something happen or were a part of something that just went totally wrong, and to not come forward and say anything. I've heard through rumor mills, like, oh, the one guy's, I was out to, chase him down or find him and beat him up or whatever when I first came back.
We're not getting. Yeah, we don't want to get into that. It's just that you'd think that once again, we don't do theories on the program. I don't voice my theories publicly or anything like that. But obviously, I know that you have this belief. Obviously, other people would still obviously have this belief in your family as well. And and to think that something could have gone on there, they're withholding information, even if they're not responsible. They're withholding information all this time. It's tough,
right? Yeah. And that's exactly what I think. And that's all I ask is, if somebody, if it's those three or anybody else, just step up and say, this is what I know. That's what's probably the toughest thing of all has been the silence. When you feel like you're beating your head against the wall and everybody's standing silent.
Mark, do you have a Facebook page, website, anything like that set up for Harry's disappearance? If so, tell the listeners and viewers about it right now.
Right. So far right now, I've got a Facebook group that I've had up and going for quite some time. It's I got so confused here. I'm not sure what the deal is, but it's Harry Milligan still missing. My brother's story. You can look at search it in the group under Harry Milligan. You'll find the group. Been going for quite a while. I got a reward fund trying to get information. We're up over $15,000 now in private donations, and it's all strictly private donations from people donating. We've used some of it to put up. In the city of Albia, we've got, let's see, six 4x8 mini billboards, my wife calls them, that have Harry's poster and Still Missing that we put up just to keep reminding everybody. We do yard signs. I got bracelets, T-shirts, all kinds of stuff that we do. And then I know right now we're working on starting an actual web page, which will be findingharrymilligan.com. That should be up and running here pretty quick, so that there's more access to everything. So if
great,
you're interested, join the group. There's a lot of great people and a lot of good conversation that we try to keep the conversation going and keep people thinking, keep getting the story out, and hoping it just resonates with somebody somewhere at some point to step up and say, hey, I know this, because I've tried to make it clear within the group, and I'll do the same thing with the website. I truly am not looking to prosecute anybody for what happened to my brother. It's 37 years later. I just want to find him, find his car, and bring him home and put him to rest.
And Mark, I hope you will keep me posted as you continue to work on this. I keep in contact with many of the guests who have been on the program, so I'm hoping that you will, keep me once again posted as the work you're doing, and if you make any, of course, breakthroughs, and of course, if I hear anything, that comes from this episode, of course, I will pass that information along to you. And I appreciate you being on this episode of Unfound.
I appreciate it very much. As soon as I know something, you'll know something, so we can get it out to everybody.
Great. Yep. All right. Thanks for being on Unfound.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And that was my March 21st, 2022 interview with Mark Milligan, brother of Harry Milligan. I thank him for joining me and all of you on this episode. In addition, I made a map analysis video for this episode. I show Harry's most likely route home and the surrounding area. Please find it on the YouTube channel. The tough part about any disappearance such as this one is that you never want to think the worst of people. For example, we never want to think parents killed their kids, but it happens. In fact, the stats say parents are usually the most likely suspects. Or we never want to think husbands killed their wives, but it happens. And once again, the stats say if wives die, the husbands usually did it. So with friends, we never want to think they did it, that they caused a disappearance or a murder. Yet the big difference between them and parents and husbands and boyfriends and girlfriends, the big difference is that platonic friends are not statistically the best suspects. Yes, guy friends kill guy friends, women friends kill women friends, but that is much, much less common than the other categories just mentioned. Why is this? Because in those others, passion and deep-seated feelings are where those crimes get started. Whereas with our everyday friends, would we say we have deep feelings or deep passion for them to the point that they could hurt us in a way that we would want to kill them? Probably not. A girlfriend telling her boyfriend that there's someone else is a lot different than a guy telling his buds, hey, I'm going to hang out with some other people tonight. Meaning, suspecting Harry's friends is not statistically or logically the best choice, even if it should still certainly be an idea. What could change all of this, though? Alcohol. How many times did Mark bring it up during the interview? Many. To the point that he admitted Harry and his friends were most likely drinking and driving that night. Alcohol can change everything. That is something all of you will have to consider. This is not to discount all of the other possibilities. Mark caused his own disappearance, and simply hasn't been found, an accident, somebody else besides his friends caused Mark to go missing. These theories are viable as well. Certainly. But if that group of friends have kept something quiet this long, they must really be bosom buddies. I'll leave the theorizing up to you.
And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a nice review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Denzel, and you've been listening to Unfound.